pleasure. My name is Mr. Hodnett, and I'm the Head of Philosophy, Values and Religion here at Hale, and it is my very great pleasure to welcome Dr. Daniel Halliday, Senior Lecturer from the University of Melbourne, to speak to us this evening. So I'd ask that you join me in giving him a warm round of applause and welcome.
Okay, thanks very much, and thanks to all of you for coming along. It's great to see you all, and it's been great being part of Hale School this week. Really fantastic. I'm going to try and keep this talk fairly light and conversational. One consequence of that is sometimes I drift away from what's on the slides. Sometimes I finish a bit too early. But if I finish too early, we can just have a few more questions. I'm scheduled to go for 45 minutes. I might go a little bit quicker than that. Okay, so does Australia have a right to exclude migrants? People like me and some of the other people in this room, I imagine. People like Mr. Hodnett.
I'm a citizen now.
You are now. You are now. Right, so this is a question that's, you know, it's always bubbling around. It often spikes ahead of an election. My feeling is that this time around it's not been one of the biggest questions about the election, but it's definitely there. So I'll start with just a brief sampling of what gets said about it. Now, I came home from work the other night, looked in my mailbox, and I had this flyer. So Fraser Anning, who's known for a variety of things, produces these flyers that suggest there's a mass immigration crisis, and we need to put this to a vote as to what's going to be done about it. Now, hopefully, there's a web link here to the Conservative National Party website. So I thought, oh, let's see what else they have to say. So I had a look, and on the website it says, among the policy objectives of the Conservative National Party are to promote the vision of Sir Henry Parkes of Australia as an English-speaking, predominantly European Christian Commonwealth, as originally described in 1901 when Australia as a nation was founded. So that was about as precise as they got on the website about immigration, but I imagine we can interpret that as being a fairly restrictive view. It's interesting that what the flyer actually says is that there should be a referendum, because of course referendum could go either way. In my former country, in Britain, they've found out that sometimes when you put a referendum up, you don't get what you expect. And I may get a chance to come back to that later. It's also interesting what the question would be in a referendum of this sort, right? Whether you just say, should we have more, should we have less? Which it's not clear quite what that comes to. Should we keep these people out or let them in? It's not really a on and off binary question. It's not like should we keep the monarchy or should we have marriage equality. It's much more of lots of different possibilities exist with respect to immigration policy, which makes it not very referendum friendly, and indeed they haven't formulated a question on this. So that's kind of interesting. Just another bit more sampling. Here's a story from The Guardian that I got on my phone just a few days ago. There's no date there, but it was last week. Almost half, I'm not sure if you can read it, but it says almost half of Australians believe immigration should be reduced, according to a poll that was just done. And down the bottom it says, survey results raise concerns about the extent of the impact of anti-immigration rhetoric in Australia's public debate. So there is a fair bit of anti-immigration rhetoric, but one of the nice things about philosophy, I feel, is that it gives you a chance. You know, these are questions around which there's much rhetoric are still serious questions. What we want to do is take the time to try and work through what some of the reasons actually are that bear one way or the other on this kind of question. So that's what I'm going to try and do with you guys this evening. So just as a bit of a heads up, so you know what's down the track, I want to say a little bit about immigration. Is one of these questions where economics and ethics sort of come together and intertwine a fair bit. In fact, a lot. It's actually quite difficult to disentangle the economic arguments from the moral arguments. And in a way, I mean, I find these questions the most interesting. Ethical questions that have got an economic dimension, I think they're the ones that most interest me. And I don't want to suggest that, you know, we should try and push apart the economic considerations and the ethical ones. Nonetheless, for the sake of making a bit of progress, I'm going to try and do that. And once I've done that, I'm going to say a little bit about what I take to be, if not the main argument, one of the more philosophically challenging arguments about immigration, and also one of the more popular of the moral arguments, which is that, look, Australia, like other countries, has a right to select migrants and to exclude migrants, grounded in this more sort of fundamental right of national self-determination. That is to say, deciding what we, or what Australia, wants as a country includes or extends to a right to decide who gets in. That's what I want to talk about. And try and unpack a little bit, and then say a little bit about, well, you know, where does this take us? Is this a plausible idea? How does it look when it's put under a bit of scrutiny? How coherent is it? And equipped with a bit of an understanding of what the idea comes to, we'll be able to draw some conclusions, or I'm going to suggest some conclusions as to how strong the right to exclude might be for a country like Australia, and how Australia's right to exclude might be a little bit different from the right held by other countries. Okay, so that's your heads up. Now, bit of background, start with some of the economic questions, and broadly speaking, I understand economic questions to be about causation, about, you know, what kind of effects does migration have on the economy, and how would changing migration policy change those effects? So, in no particular order, these are questions like, you know, what kind of role does migration play in facilitating economic growth or prosperity? Okay, you hear a lot of disagreement about that. Closely related is, you know, when migrants come to Australia in relatively large numbers, how well are we able to cope with that in terms of our infrastructure and our other public services? What kinds of pressure would at least large migration place on those kinds of resources? And, you know, what's a migrant population going to do? Are they going to spread around the country and show up, you know, here, there, and everywhere? Are they going to crowd into certain areas, perhaps in ways that are, you know, at least economically problematic? Are we going to get a more segregated society in which perhaps we've got, you know, what are sometimes called ghettos, where a migrant population lives and doesn't interact much with the wider population? Those are all causal questions, right? Any answer to these questions is going to have to depend on a fair amount of effort at gathering relevant evidence and, you know, extrapolating from it, trying to make some kind of prediction. Okay, so I'm going to try and stay neutral on these questions because I just don't have the kind of expertise to answer them. So try and stay neutral, but we can maybe talk about them in the Q&A. The more philosophical questions that I'm more comfortable with, well, there's a bunch of these as well. And again, in no particular order, one thing that philosophers debate, and they debate along with, you know, lawyers and other kinds of social scientists, is, are there different kinds of migrants? Do different kinds of migrants have a different kind of entitlement to gain access to the country? And so quite a lot said about, you know, what should we make of legal distinctions between economic migrants, you know, people like me, people who came to Australia because there's a work opportunity but aren't really trying to escape anything dreadful. At least it didn't look that way at the time. But, you know, in all seriousness, there are categories of migrant that are really trying to get into countries like Australia because things are really bad in their country of origin or the country that they're in before. So asylum seekers who are perhaps trying to escape some kind of persecution, right, who might be tortured or imprisoned by their governments, and refugees who might be trying to escape maybe a natural disaster. I mean, one particularly interesting question is what are we going to do about climate refugees, right? The possibility that if sea levels rise, some of the Pacific islands are not going to exist anymore. And, you know, what are we going to... There's a lot to be said about, there's a very difficult question about whether an entire population of a Pacific island, would they be allowed to migrate en masse so they can stick together, stay with each other, or would they be required to spread around if countries won't take all of them at once? That's an important moral question. Closely related to the last of the economic questions is, you know, what can we ask of migrants once they get here? Okay, once a migrant has been allowed into Australia, what do they have to do to integrate? What does integration really mean? Might mean something about learning a language, might mean something about making an effort to consume certain kinds of local culture, or it might just not mean very much. You might think, well, there's no real requirement to integrate. People disagree about this. But I take that to be a moral question. Last but not least, there's this question about, and this isn't really a question about the right to exclude, sort of turns it on its head. There might be an obligation to exclude because there's evidence that when some countries lose citizens to migration in ways that are really economically costly. So the example that's most often discussed is sub-Saharan African countries, places like Ghana and Zambia, they're pretty good at training nurses and other medical professionals. Once the nurses are trained, a lot of them want to leave and get jobs in Canada or Britain or maybe Australia. And for many years, these countries have been in a position of losing more nurses than they train. Right? So they've got a brain drain. Is that a moral reason to restrict migration? Right? Given that migrants are often the most skilled, or anyway, the younger members of the country they're leaving, do they hurt their country sometimes when they leave? Okay. So those are just some background questions. I'm not really going to grapple at length with any of these, but they're ones you might want to bring up later. Right, so as I said, the problem with the Fraser-Anning flyer is that, or the problem with the idea of a referendum on migration is that we've got a spectrum of possibilities rather than a sort of this thing or that thing. And so the disagreement centres around whether we should err towards open borders, whereby the borders are open, people can cross them pretty much whenever they feel like it. Or closed borders, where you can't cross, the border's a barrier, okay, and that barrier is enforced, or something in between. So I'll say a little bit about reasons or alleged candidate reasons for open borders. Look, freedom of movement is really important, okay? Being free to move around the world makes a huge difference to many people's ability to advance their interests. That doesn't necessarily say anything about any particular country's right to exclude, but if you believe that freedom of movement is this really important thing in general, you might err in favour of open borders. Yeah? And not only is the freedom really important, but you don't choose where you start off in life. No one chooses where they're born. It's impossible. Okay? It's not your fault. You know, those of us who are born in Australia or indeed Britain or other economically advanced countries, we're the lucky ones. But a huge fraction of the global population is much less fortunate than that. Born into countries that have got poverty, war, prone to environmental disasters that there isn't infrastructure to cope with. That's really bad luck. Freedom of movement would relieve that kind of inequality of starting point in life. So philosophers who favour open borders often draw on that consideration as well. Another view, more of a, I hate to use this terminology, but more of a right-wing view than a left-wing view, is that, look, governments shouldn't use coercion nearly as much as they do. If you're going to have closed borders, you're going to have guards with guns or whatever using force to keep people out of the territory. It's just a bad thing when governments use force without really, really good reason. If coercion by governments is generally hard to justify, it's been argued that that counts in favour of open borders too. People who believe in market freedoms often argue that, you know, the movement of labour around the world is a really, if you care about markets and you think we're a capitalist society, how can you restrict the movement of labour? It's one of the most essential freedoms to a market, or so it's argued. And on the other side, reasons for closed borders. Well, I've already talked about one, we've got the brain drain thing. We should close borders or close certain borders to certain kinds of professionals, certain kinds of skilled migrants, to stop poor countries from just, you know, remaining poor, remaining in a bad position. You might think as well, look, developed countries like Australia, the argument that we should let migrants in because of, you know, all the problems overseas to do with wars, disease, climate problems, wouldn't it be better if we just made more of an effort to fix those problems so that people didn't want to move? I mean, one thing that's often forgotten in the debate about migrants is that a lot of migrants don't really want to be migrants, right? They're migrants because they feel they've got no choice. Or at any rate, migrants would very often prefer that the problems they face in their home country or the country they're already in, would often prefer that those problems got sorted out, or at least mitigated, so that they didn't feel they had to leave and take the kind of risks that they do take in getting into countries like Australia. And then last but not least, and this is where this is the one I want to get stuck into, we should have closed borders, relatively, because unrestricted immigration undermines or jeopardises our national self-determination. That's the one I want to talk about. Okay. How am I doing for time?
You have lots of it.
Lots of it. All right, that's all I need to know. So just to give you, what's the big idea here? What's this self-determination? So this is how the argument might look like. The basic argument that I want to expand on, I reckon it goes a bit like this. Now look, Australia is just like other countries in that it's got its own kind of distinctive culture that's not really quite like the culture of anywhere else. It's distinctive. It's overlaps with other cultures, and I'll get back to that, but it's its own culture. All right? Australia's a special place. And that culture is valuable, and we should do what we can to preserve it and not let it disappear or degrade or change in ways that, you know, lose some of its valuable elements. Yeah? But if Australia does not have the power to exclude migrants, at least to a certain extent, then the preservation of culture becomes harder. Maybe it's impossible, or maybe preservation of culture is just made unacceptably costly when you can't control who's coming in. So that's the basic idea, and the conclusion, therefore, these considerations, you put them together, you can draw the conclusion that there is a right to exclude migrants. That's the basic argument. And the question is how strong an interpretation of this argument still stands up. All right? Just to confirm that this is a popular view, I do see the self-determination argument quite often in political rhetoric. Going back a few years, someone who put this very concisely, very explicitly, was John Howard. He was very straight up on these issues. We will decide who comes to this country and the circumstances in which they come. That sounds like an endorsement of a pretty strong right to exclude. And he's got more to say about self-determination. We'll hear from him in a minute on self-determination. Rather than just rely on politicians, so far I've had Fraser Anning and John Howard, I want to draw a little bit on philosophers. And here's a pretty old crusty philosopher, but very influential ethicist, Henry Sidgwick. And he's got a lot to say about it. There's a lot going on in this quote. So I'm going to read it out and leave it up for a bit. And Sidgwick believed, and he argued in his Elements of Politics from the 1890s, the governmental function of promoting moral and intellectual culture might be rendered hopelessly difficult by the continual inflowing streams of alien immigrants with diverse moral habits and religious traditions. So that's a fancy way of saying, yeah, countries should have a right to exclude, otherwise they won't be able to control their culture. Or the government won't be able to control the culture. Now I've got some questions I want to bring up about what's going on here, what's in this quote. First of all, what should we make of the kind of claims that moral and intellectual culture are the kind of things that get promoted? What does that mean? Culture as a promotable thing. I want to say a bit about that. Why is Sidgwick, what's this business about continual inflowing streams of migrants? Is that the only kind of migration we could have? Is Sidgwick saying that migration would have to be that extreme in order for this governmental function to be undermined? Is that what he's saying? And even more abstractly, since when was it a government function? Or what kind of government could function so as to promote culture? What's the relation between culture and government? I'm used to hearing about government functions like, you know, taxation and controlling the money supply, having an army and a police force. They all sound like government responsibilities. Promotion of culture, that's a little bit less clear to me in what way that's a government responsibility. So lots of questions here that I think bear on the interpretation of the self-determination argument. Now, I want to say one thing, which I think is that some version of the right to exclude grounded in self-determination must be true. Even if it's only a weak version, it's got to be true, and here's why I think this. There's got to be something wrong about colonialism, right? It's got to be. And obviously, the kind of colonialism that's actually happened is wrong because it's involved, you know, large-scale murder, genocide, theft, and all the other stuff that we associate with colonialism. But we're doing philosophy, so we're allowed to think of, you know, far-fetched but coherent kinds of colonialism. Perfectly coherent colonialism would be a non-violent sort, where big countries just come along and annex smaller countries or less powerful countries and just say, right, you're part of us now. You've got all the, you know, we're not going to suppress you, but we're going to give you the same political rights that we give to our own people, and they're not bad rights. So imagine that the United States just says, okay, Australia, you're now the next state. Yeah? You can all vote in US elections, and you can all own guns, and you can do all the other things that American citizens are allowed to do, but you're us now. And if you think the USA wouldn't be a great deal, substitute it for your favourite other country, New Zealand or I don't know, right? But just imagine that we're going to call this colonialism because a country takes over another country, but does it in ways that don't involve any attempt to oppress or anything like that. There would still be something wrong with this, I take it. Right? There'd be something, never mind that it's far-fetched, it would be undesirable. Australia would say no thanks. We don't want to be your 51st state. And, you know, well, we don't want to be the West Island of New Zealand or something like that. You know, we don't fancy this, would probably be the response. And that I'm going to suggest that response wouldn't change no matter how high the quality of life or how desirable life is in the country that was doing the colonising. And the only good answer for this is that countries have some kind of identity and autonomy that they want to keep for themselves. Otherwise, these far-fetched cases, we'd have a different intuition about them. So that's just, you know, one way in which we can do a bit of philosophy and think about a far-fetched scenario and realise that I think there is something to this self-determination idea, just we're still not sure how strong the idea is. Okay. So some version of this view must be true, I think, but there's stronger and weaker possibilities. So I'll start with the stronger view. Goes something like this. Our culture is our business. It's something we've designed. It's a result of our choices, our plans. It's our affair. And people who hold this view sometimes suggest that there's an analogy between states, countries like Australia, and smaller organisations about which you might make these claims quite uncontroversially. Excuse me. So, you know, think about a private club, a golf club, and I want to be a member of the golf club, and the golf club's allowed to say, no, you can't join because we've got enough members. And I'll say, oh, but look, there's loads of space on the golf course. You know, your members don't show up that much. I really want to join. They're still allowed to say, no, you can't. Because we're a private club, what we say goes, and it's up to us if we want to take new members this year or not. People say similar things about, you know, universities, families. You know, there might be a family I really want to join. I might really want to marry someone who's in a family and say, I really want to marry you because your family is great and I really want to be part of it. They don't have to say yes. Now, I know this sounds a little bit facetious because we're not joining, you know, being in the position of wanting to join a golf club or marry someone is not really like the position that a migrant's in very often. And I don't want to undermine that. But the idea here is just that certain kinds of organisations, we're familiar with this kind of claim made about certain kinds of smaller organisations who do seem to have some kind of identity that they want to preserve and maintain, and sometimes that preservation and maintenance involves saying, no, nothing personal, but we're not having you join at this time. Okay? And one way to support the strong view that the state has a similarly strong right to exclude is in suggesting that there's an analogy between, you know, countries are just like big clubs or big families or big universities. If they don't want to expand their membership, they don't have to. Okay? And so that's one way of defending the strong view. And by the way, that's pretty much what this guy seemed to think. Look at the language here. We will decide what the cultural identity and the cultural destiny of this country will be and nobody else. So John Howard, admittedly this is a long time ago, 1988, he's talking about culture. He's talking, I think, about Australia as if it's a bit like a family or a golf club. Right? It's going to choose its membership and it's going to choose its identity and its cultural destiny. Okay, and by the way, it's not racist or immoral or anything to think that, right? So I take that to be a fairly clear articulation of, albeit without the analogies, of the strong view. So is the strong view true? Is the strong view defensible? Well, I suspect not, and here's why I think that. Culture, look, whatever we say about golf clubs and universities and families, and I'm prepared to say that small organisations can plan their identity and carefully maintain it. I just don't think culture is really like that. Nobody actually sat down and determined our cultural destiny. And you know what, if anyone, well, maybe no one did and succeeded, right? Maybe someone sat down in the 1900s and said, right, Australia's going to be this way. But Australia turned out the way it turned out in spite of any such efforts. So culture evolves over time, but it evolves in what, you know, philosophers sometimes call it a spontaneous fashion. It's sort of haphazard, it's sort of randomizing. Certain elements emerge and they stick around, certain elements emerge and go away again. But the analogy between a culture and a language is much stronger than the analogy between a culture or a country and a golf club. You know, languages, really quite complicated things, but they got here on their own. Natural languages got here on their own. No one sat down and designed them. Sure, there are rules which we can write down after they've evolved, but no one designed the English language from scratch or any other language. And you could say that about, I think, most other elements of culture. I think certainly food, literature, other traditions. Not entirely sure about sports, because sports sort of do get invented. But even so, how sports get invented is not a matter of central government control. I mean, maybe the government could try and invent some sports, but probably wouldn't improve on any of the ones we've already got. So I think culture is this sort of spontaneous thing, and I think that counts against the strong view. And it counts against the idea that we decide what the cultural identity and cultural destiny will be. And by the way, this isn't I'm not suggesting, I actually agree with this claim insofar as I agree that it wouldn't be racist or immoral to say we decide the cultural destiny of the country. It would just be false. You just can't do that. Okay? Nothing racist about it. It's just not what could happen. Okay. So if the strong view's out, well, we're left with what you might call the moderate view, or sort of some view further down the spectrum between closed borders and open borders. So look, governments can't control culture altogether. They can't plan the whole thing, but they might. Governments might be able to, you know, do something. They might be able to promote or suppress certain kinds of culture, and governments have done this kind of thing with some success. When I was growing up, the government was all about young boys must read loads and loads of Shakespeare. So I had to read lots of Shakespeare at school. Probably Shakespeare was going to be fine anyway, in terms of cultural appreciation, but things like that do happen. And so you might think that, you know, large migration might be the kind of thing that, in controlling, government manages to protect culture. You might think that. Question is, how moderate is this view going to be? And here's where I think we're led to some sort of unintuitive but interesting implications. As I said, Australia's got a distinctive culture. That is to say, the culture of Australia and the culture of various other countries, they're different from each other. And I think that means something when it comes to how fragile they are, or at any rate, what kind of effect migration will have on a culture depends on the culture. And some nations, including Australia, have a culture that is already a product of years of migration. Okay, and if migration already is a substantial driver of your culture, it's very strange to say that migration stands to undermine the culture or to damage the culture. It might continue to change it, but that's already the way the culture's going. And so, just to put this a bit more explicitly, Australia is, you know, one of the world's migrant nations. Okay, alongside the indigenous people, the population is largely descended from migrants, many quite recent. Okay, a lot of the boys here, I asked some of the boys, you know, who's got a parent from overseas, and a lot of the boys put their hands up. And who's got two parents from overseas? A lot of the hands stayed up. And, you know, this isn't to denigrate Australian culture in the slightest, right? There's various imported elements that have been combined, but their combination has, you know, created a really valuable culture. And, you know, not only that, but arguably improvements. So, go back to the old Brexit case. the Australian system of government is somewhat like the British system in that it has, you know, it's bicameral, there's two houses, there's an upper and lower house. The executive is built into the lower house, the cabinet and the prime minister, that kind of thing. But something like Brexit couldn't really happen in Australia, I think. And the reason it couldn't happen is Brexit is a fairly good exercise in what can go disastrously wrong when you don't have a written constitution. Australia has a written constitution, the British don't, which is why the British don't know what to do when what's happened can't be addressed by asking what we did last time. Right? Because there is no last time. So you don't know what to do. So it's all made up. Right? I mean, if you had a written constitution like Australia does, it would tell you what a referendum, it would set rules for a referendum, right? It would say something about what kind of question can be asked. For heaven's sake, don't just have a one, should we remain, and not even say anything about what leaving means. You're getting a complete mess if people ask for it. And so, you know, there's improvements, okay? Being a migrant nation means you get a second bite of the cherry with the cultures that the cultural influences that you're bringing together, right? So what I want to say, partly that's what makes Australian culture valuable, but it also makes, I think Australian culture is pretty strong. It's pretty tough, right? It's already pretty fluid and it's able to endure change, including the kind of changes that migration might continue to bring about, because it's already enjoying those changes. It already is those changes, okay? Just for the sake of one graph, Australia is, you know, what by percentage of residents, or was it percentage of population born overseas, Australia is one of the highest in the world. There's a few countries that are a fair bit higher in the Persian Gulf, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain. That's because they basically import indentured labourers. Of countries that don't do that, we in Australia are among the countries that have the highest rate of immigration. So you might say this is a more provocative way of putting it, I suppose. The cultural horse has bolted, right? I mean, compare Australia to countries whose culture is very, very much not shaped by migration. Now, I've picked on Japan here, but this might go for other countries with very small populations, like Pacific microstates. Japan has historically very, very low migration. Okay, they have a big tourist industry, but they're not really, for a long time, they've got a long history of not letting people in to stay. Now, it might be that countries like Japan, or countries with very small populations, fairly homogeneous small populations, these are the fragile cultures, right? These are the cultures that might be damaged if large-scale migration were to become a feature of some of these countries, okay? These are the cultures that are more different from the Australian culture than other places. So where does this take us? Well, look, I think here's what we should say. First of all, we should say that a culture that's already good at absorbing migrants is something to be glad about. We should remember that. But it might mean that if that's the kind of culture you've got, your right to exclude, or the right to exclude insofar as it derives from national self-determination, is a good deal weaker, perhaps, than the right held by other countries. So it might be that Australian culture is really strong, used to absorbing migrants, that's part of its value, not much of a right to exclude, so far as self-determination is concerned. Japanese culture, not used to taking migrants, kind of fragile for that reason, strong right to exclude. Now you might think this is a little bit perverse, right? Why would the fact that you've got a history of taking migrants mean that you've got less entitlement to have closed borders than countries that have a history of excluding migrants? That might sound kind of weird, right? And it is a bit weird. What I might say is that if Australia is in a position to take lots of migrants, it might also be in a position to ask Japan to take care of something else, right? So particularly if we think there's a need to have cooperation at the global level to help refugees and asylum seekers, and Australia can do, you know, more than the average country in taking some of these migrants, and Japan can't, then there's a case for asking Japan to, you know, absorb the cost of some other element of global cooperation. I put climate change up here. I dare say climate change is enough of a problem that all countries need to do a lot, but some other example might be more compelling. Okay, so there might be some kind of global trading between wealthy countries of who does what. Australia might take on the migration role and ask other countries to do something else. So by way of conclusions, culture does have value and it is distinctive. Okay, and migration will change culture, but it's already changing culture. In countries like Australia, it's already been changing culture for a long time, and it's a source of a lot that's valuable about our culture. Now, appealing to self-determination, therefore, isn't really going to establish an Australian right to exclude. It might establish a stronger right to exclude for other nations, nations that are not, quotes, migrant nations. Australia is not one of those nations. Okay? Now, I told you, I tried to make it clear that, you know, I have picked on one angle, one dimension of the topic, this idea of self-determination. There might be really good arguments for a strong right to exclude that draw on some of the other considerations, moral and or economic. But those kinds of arguments are going to have to come from considerations that really don't overlap very much with considerations of cultural self-determination. So, stop there.
Okay, thank you very much. What that does is give us a good opportunity to have a question